Peter, it's such a pleasure to have you here in BC with us. Tell us what brought you out to Vancouver this time around.
Well, we're showing my new film, Birdland, which is a noir kind of thriller movie. It's my first dramatic film, and we're showing it at the Pacific Cinematheque starting this evening.
Now, not only do you direct this film, you did the screenplay, you also are one of the producers on it. Tell us what makes you become so much of one project.
I'm a bit of a masochist. No, no, it's, well, I like to have a certain amount of creative control, and when you make your own film, there's trade-offs when you give over power to other collaborators, and film is a very collaborative medium. I love to collaborate, but I also like to have, it's a kind of film that's a very personal film, and so I wanted to have a certain amount of control. So by being the writer, producer, director, you have more control.
Where does the idea for such a drama come from?
This particular film came out of very personal kind of circumstances. I was in Montreal about 10 years ago, and I was in a cafe, and I saw a woman walk by that reminded me of someone who sadly died a number of years earlier that I knew. But it gave me a charge. I kind of thought somehow she was alive, and or it was her sister, like a kind of a double figure. So there was some kind of like sex and death charge to it, And I wrote a short story on the train back to Toronto, and I called it Blackbird at the time. And since then, a number of years, I worked with another writer, and at that point I put it on the shelf and looked at it a few years later and wrote down Birdland and completely rewrote it. So it came out of sort of personal life, but it's also full of dreams and imagination.
And with that imagination, it's got so many twists and turns to it. You're watching it and you have no idea what to expect. And it's all put together so well. What I want to know is when you're shooting, or when you're writing it out even, are you writing it in order, and then once it's together, you go to flashbacks? How do you do it?
This particular film I did know that it was going to have a flashback component, and that there was an interrogation that would allow us to go in and out of the person's imagination, and also what the surveilled world that they were under. Because as you know, the story is about a woman who surveils her own marriage and puts cameras in. And so at one point she's being interrogated based on her own surveillance. So that gave me the freedom to move between past and present, and also blur the lines between what was in her imagination or what she prefers to tell you versus what the cops that are surveilling her and asking her what she's about, or it blurs all those lines. So, but the editing process was, we even fractured it further. With a low budget film, you also have certain limitations, and my wife and I, she's the editor of the film, Caroline Christie, she has a lot of documentary experience and television, and we decided that we wanted to have the freedom that you could with a documentary to even take the material and push it even further that way.
It's crazy, and with technology these days, it's not far-fetched. There's a lot of people that will put cameras up in their homes. Why do you think that's an important thing for your movie to have?
So when I first started working on Birdland, surveillance was something that was really kind of that grainy, degraded image that you would see in a corner store or in a bank, or when you pull up to the stop lights and you're being surveilled that way. But now we're completely immersed in a mediated world where if we use our credit card, our cell phone, even if you're on Facebook, you are being surveilled to different degrees. And so the lines are completely blurred. And I wanted to also explore the idea that how we develop our own personas now and put them on Facebook or Instagram or Twitter. We have this persona that we would prefer to present ourselves as, but everyone else is looking at it and making their own meaning out of it, So I wanted to have that, explore how we've become actors in our own kind of movie in a way. And so Birdland looks at that world between what people prefer to believe about themselves and what is being shown. And so there's a conflict that happens between those two worlds.
And what I like about you is the fact that you do have so many hands in your own film. So like you said, it can't be taken and twisted into something else.
Right.
For me personally, that's huge, and it pays an homage to your credibility.
Right.
When it came down to editing your movie, I'm assuming you were right there with your wife watching.
Yeah, I mean, Interestingly enough, I try to stay out of the edit suite as much as possible, but I look at cuts, and I look at them very often and write kind of notes, and then I show them, talk about it. We put it on cards, and then I let my wife we have like a 20-something year collaboration, so there's a kind of a language that we've evolved over the years, almost like a shorthand, that stylistically we're very in sync. So I don't like to sit there and go, cut, move this like that. She would beat me up if I did. But also, I like to have a bit of distance. I like to have the editor bring their abilities and their detachment to it. But at the same time, I am actively involved. But it's the way I like to do it is to look at it as many times as possible and keep sort of rewriting, clarifying what it is, what the structure is, how, and is this the story I want to tell.
Now, before we get to the 20 years of collaboration that you've done, you are doing a few screenings, not only in Vancouver, but a little bit across Canada. Can you tell me about them?
Yeah, well, we started off in Toronto, my hometown, and we had some really interesting screenings. The first one was at the TIFF Bell Lightbox, and Adam Agoyan did the, I was just going to say MC. Adam Agoyan was the moderator, and my wife and the production designer, Patricia Christie, joined me, and it was for the Directors Guild of Canada, and that was a great first screening. And I had another screening where I showed all my early shorts, so it was a kind of a prelude to show people where I'd sort of come out of. And then now we're showing, we did Calgary and Regina and Edmonton, and now it's coming to Vancouver tonight and showing a number of times at the Pacific Cinematheque, and next then off to Winnipeg, and then out east. Yeah.
Amazing. That must be so exciting to see your project come together and watch people watch your thing.
I mean, seeing your film go from the page onto the screen is the most thrilling thing. To be with an audience, because we live in an age where most people have home systems that are almost as good as or better than the theaters. And once you come home from work and have a glass of wine, you go, oh, I could put on HBO or Netflix. So it's very competitive to get eyeballs on your film. So to be able to show it in a theater where people come out and you can talk to them and engage them, that's what getting people to talk about your film, I think, is the greatest thing.
And you had, I would say, one of the biggest things in film. Not only people talking about your film, but The Simpsons actually took one of your documentaries and did a spoof on it. What was that like?
It's kind of like being in the pantheon of pop culture. But yeah, my film Project Grizzly, which also showed out here and has kind of like a cult following. It's got a big YouTube kind of cult following to it. And first Quentin Tarantino saw it at a screening in LA, and he gave it a big shout out that year. And then it was funny because I was in a bar in Kitsilano and I saw a drawing that was from someone from The Simpsons, from Matt Goring, and he told the bartender he wanted to make a show on Project Grizzly. And then I had another friend that was on a plane to LA and was with some guy talking to a guy from South Park. They're friends with the Simpsons guys, and they were daring each other who was going to do it first, right? So then they did a whole show. I think it's called The Fattest and the Furriest.
Amazing. What goes through your mind when you hear that these people are going to do this?
Well, it makes you feel alive in the world, that people are responding to something you've done, and that mythology starts to take on a life of its own beyond you. And I think that's the beauty and power of storytelling, is that it can evoke, captures people's imaginations, and that it can take on its own form and go beyond you out into the world, I guess.
And your career didn't actually start in film. You were involved with Sony to begin with.
Well, when I started out, I used to produce an international video festival called Video Culture, and Sony was the biggest sponsor. And it was at a time when music videos were exploding, video art, artists were doing weird things with technology, and sort of all the things we know now, like television, the way we can store information, HD television. All these things were in their early experimental form, and what I did is provided a forum for artists to experiment with it and to collaborate with engineers to sort of imagine what this technology could be. So it was kind of like, for me, going to school, and I would invite people that I would admire, like David Byrne from Talking Heads, Brian Eno, different people that I was a big fan of in music and things. They became kind of like my mentors and led me to build my own confidence, to do my own work.
That's insane. Did you ever imagine that technology would go this far, that we'd be here today?
When I started out with technology and experimenting with the festival I did, and Sony was the sponsor of, technology was always in its prototype. It was like being with inventors and seeing all like the tape and things stuck together like in a very crude way. But it was all about ideas, but the money wasn't. The money was only there to experiment, but it wasn't it wasn't like how Netflix is now, or people are now. Cell phones are doing what people imagine they could do, but there was only in a kind of play almost play acting, it was like stick people almost, and now it's 3D computer graphics and everything is all those ideas are manifesting and actually happening. So on one level it would have been nice to be able to cash in more back then knowing what I knew, but at the same time there's a beauty in seeing it all, how it sprawls into all these things, some things you could never imagine. I mean, back then when there wasn't even email, like email was just starting, or cell phones were these giant things that you could carry around, right? I did a movie called Arrowhead, and it's my first drama. I made it in 1993, and I'm on top of a building, and this character a superintendent shows up, and he's like telling them to get off the top of the building, and he's got this giant cell phone. It's the only thing that gives it away, that it was shot back then, yeah.
Now that you know everything that you do know now about technology, is there a certain route that you would take to do your next film, or would you go back to the basics?
Well, technology helped me with this film on a number of levels. Like, for example, the camera we shot with, you could see out the windows and see what the eye sees at night. Whereas, say, 3 years ago from then, you would have to light it more. You know what I mean? So the cameras get faster, they get more advanced. It's still traditional ideas that drive it. Like, it's still about storytelling. So for me, storytelling drives and ideas drive technology. And so imagination is something you can't leave out of the equation. You could program it in, but I still think you need the human component. And also just, you want it to serve humanity and our ideals and our social needs, rather than having it be like a runaway train and take over our lives, which it can do. And we do, there are, like, say, kids now, a lot of them don't know how to write or draw because they're so reliant on, they come up with their own languages and algorithms for reality that we never could imagine would have been. And I think you still have to keep writing and drawing and that kind of keep in touch with imagination, even though the technology is more nimble, faster, higher res, can do more things, can serve you. But I still think you have to keep it like an apprentice to serve you, as opposed to it controlling your ideas.
I like that. That's very on point, I think. Now, with your imagination, while watching Birdland, I can only imagine it's something that doesn't stop. It's got to be on the go all the time.
Right.
So are you already working on your next project?
I have a couple of films. One is based on Paul Quarrington's, an author who died a few years ago. He wrote a book called Galveston, and it's about storm chasers. And it's a kind of a love story in the time of global warming. And I'm working with an actor who used to live in Vancouver quite a lot, Gil Bellows, and also Marty Cates, who produces David Cronenberg. And so we're working on casting and looking to put that together right now. And I'm also working on some dramatic series, doing one on Henry Hudson, but it's going to have like Sex Pistols music and very anarchistic and stylish, and with the author Tony Burgess, who wrote Pontypool, that Bruce McDonald made a film of. And I'm also doing a film called The Love Supreme with Bruce McDonald, a filmmaker in Toronto. It's a kind of a jazz movie, but it's a portrait of a neighborhood in Little Italy in Toronto. It's kind of a little love letter to the neighborhood that we used to hang out together in. And so those are some of the things I'm trying to keep busy.
So having grown up in Toronto, residing in Toronto, we see it in Birdland, we're going to see it in your next movie. Is that something that really, in your heart, you feel like you need to stick true to, you need to stay there? Well,
Toronto is a place that I've spent my entire life in. I mean, I've lived around the world, I've traveled a lot, but I know it from the ground up, from the geology, the archaeology, the First Nations history. For me, the Don River is like my Nile, and the islands are like my Venice. but the world of Birdland is a world of the imagination and a kind of a dreamland, almost like a nightmare manifesting in a part of the city that's not really where I hang out with, which is sort of condo land and more, it's a different kind of, there's a lot of reflections and illusions, and though there are some places that I went since I was a boy, like the museum, the Royal Ontario Museum, there's a motif of dinosaurs and birds. There's an ornithologist that's one of the main characters, and I've been going there since I was a boy, so it's a kind of a memory theater for me, where my imagination between the past and the present all kind of collide, right? So the city for me really is part of myself, but it's also, I think that Birdland springs from the wellspring of imagination of having lived in a place. So I think I've given it a language that's very particular to the dream of Birdland, and I kind of see it almost like it's turned into a giant bird cage, and that these characters, surveillance is, they're trapped in this world that's surveilled, but they're also, like, even the women sometimes are almost hanging bird-like in different aspects in the story, you know what I mean? So it's got that, but yeah, the city for me is a real character in the story, but it is one that is not just a real city, it's as much a city of my imagination.
It gives us a little insight to who you are and how you see the Toronto, I feel.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I mean, yeah, there's parks that I walk through every day. There's a friend of mine who's a well-known architect, John Schneer, let me shoot in his condo. Visual painters and artists that are in the TD Towers, the Mies van der Rohe buildings. They have work in those buildings. They got me the art consultants to get me the owners of the building to give me permission to film there. So all my connections, all my love and past and collaborations in the past sort of came into to help me make this film.
That's amazing and so important, and again speaks to your character.
Oh,
That's amazing.
Sure.
I have one more question that I try to ask each of my guests.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually about your socks. I feel like socks tell a lot about a person, and I'd
Okay.
like to know if you'll show me yours.
You know, I told tonight I was going to wear a cooler pair. These are
Oh, those are funky.
these are okay, but they're not like, I was going to wear these English ones that have stripes that I'm going to wear tonight.
Okay.
They're more fancy, but because I was going a bit low key, I went pretty standard. But
They're good though.
Good
I like
question,
them.
though.
Thank you.
Socks are important.
Are they? They are, right? They get your day set off on the right foot.
Exactly. And if I was really cool right now, I'd be showing them more, and I'd have my pants pulled up higher. But
Awesome. So are they always funky then?
not always. Like sometimes I just have my day-to-day socks, but I love cool socks though.
I'm happy to hear that. That's why we get along so well. That's great. Thank you so much, Peter.
Thank you. You're welcome.